following the story of Abraham and Sarah and their descendants for most of the summer. And somebody told me after church last Sunday that it can be kind of hard to keep track of names. Indeed it can. It's kind of like reading a novel, and there's all these names, and you don't know who's who, and you're trying to keep track of all the names. It can be that way in the Bible sometimes. So we started with Abraham and Sarah, and they had Ishmael and then Isaac. Then we followed Isaac's story for a while, and Isaac married Rebekah, and they had Jacob and Esau. And last week, Jacob and Esau, we talked about them specifically. We talked about the level of dysfunction in the family. They didn't really like each other. They competed against each other. And Jacob tricked Esau out of his birthright and his blessing. And then, as a result, Esau was so upset that he was going to kill Jacob. And so Rebekah wanted to send Jacob away so he'd be safe. So she wanted him to go live with her brother, his uncle, Laban, back in her homeland where she came from, Harlan. And so she sends him off. But now, our sermon today actually covers 3 chapters in Genesis. And it starts off with Isaac, interestingly enough, sending Jacob off. So Isaac gives Jacob a blessing. That's his dad. Isaac is Jacob's dad. He sends Jacob off with a blessing and says, do not look for a wife from amongst the Canaanites here. Instead, go back to and find a wife from amongst your uncle Laban's daughters. That was common in those days, as we said in a past sermon, to marry from within your own family. And that's interesting, isn't it? Because that's not why they were sending Jacob away. You know, in our story last week, they were sending him away to save his life. But you see, Rebekah told her husband Isaac, oh, I'm so worried that Jacob is going to find a wife from amongst these people here. Oh, what will happen if he does? And so then Isaac sends him off to find a wife. So it seems as though they're sending him off for different reasons. Isaac thinks it's to find a wife. Rebekah says it's to save his life. Turns out to be both. But, you know, Isaac and Rebekah didn't necessarily have the best communication in the world, and they seem to be under false pretenses to some extent. But either way, Jacob is sent off. And so he goes, and during his journey, he stops and he sleeps and uses a stone for a pillow, and he has that familiar dream, the stairway to heaven, where he has the ladder and the angels ascending and descending. And God repeats his promise to them, the same promise that he gave to Abraham and Isaac, he gives to Jacob. And so Jacob continues on his way, and he gets to a well nearby, and he meets Rachel there, who would later become his wife. Not quite yet, but later she would become his wife. You know, it's interesting because just 2 weeks ago, that we had another story with a well, where a guy meets a girl. And so it seems like the well is the meeting place to find your spouse in those days, kind of like at ancient eharmony.com or something. But so he goes to the well and he meets Rachel, and he finds out that she is of Laban's family, the family he's looking for. And so he goes and he lives with the family, with Uncle Laban. And so he works for Laban. And his uncle says it's not right that we should have you work for free, so name your price, name your wages. And Jacob says, how about your daughter? And it would be, excuse me, that's what we would say. But back then that was not that out there of a question. And so we know that marriage was a little different back then. And so he agrees to the terms. You work for 7 years, Jacob, and you can marry my daughter Rachel. So he works for 7 years, and then he's going to be married. But lo and behold, somehow, don't ask me how, but somehow Uncle Laban tricks him and has him marry Rachel's sister, Leah. And when Jacob finds out, his uncle says, oh, well, we have a custom where we give away the oldest first. So, well, we find out that Jacob is the trickster, but here he is tricked by his uncle. And I don't know if that was really a custom or not, but it seems like it was really clear. You work for 7 years, you marry Rachel. So it seems like he has been duped. But Laban says, oh, don't worry, you work for another 7 years, and you can have Rachel as your wife. But the thing is, he was able to have Rachel as his wife right away. So he didn't have to wait another 7 years. He actually married Rachel with the promise that he would work for another 7 years. So that's the way it goes. 14 years of working, and during those 14 total years, they built quite a family for themselves. Again, families in biblical times were much different than they are now, not necessarily ideal. And so this family involved 2 women and each women's servants. And so the 2 women, Leah and Rachel, see, back then, women's value was seen mostly in the ability to have children. And fortunately, today we are moving away from that, although that stigma still remains. And so the 2 sisters were kind of in competition as far as who was more blessed, who was more valuable. And so if they could have a child, they were considered blessed. And if they had a time period where they couldn't have a child, they were seen as being devalued. And so they would kind of fight for that. They would want to say, well, I gave him a child. Oh yeah, well, and so they continued to have this competition. And much like Abraham and Sarah, when Sarah couldn't conceive, she gave her servant to Abraham. They would do the same thing. So through this rather strange process, they end up with 12 sons, and these 12 sons will end up being the beginnings of the 12 tribes of Israel. And so this is a really large family, and he gathers all these flocks and animals and things like that. And so the 14 years are up, and he says, I think I'm ready to return back to my family. But Uncle Laban doesn't want him to leave, because you see, he feels like he's been blessed since they've been here. And so he convinces him to continue working for him, but their relationship goes sour, which you could see that coming. You know, you could see the seeds for that from quite a while ago. And pretty soon, Uncle Laban feels as though he's being cheated by Jacob and that he's getting rich at his expense. In fact, they both come to feel that they are both being cheated by the other. And so Jacob knew, I just need to leave. And so they get to the time, 20 years after he got there. Jacob decides it's time for he and his family to leave and to go back to Canaan. And so he and his uncle, they never really resolve everything, but they form a treaty that says that they're going to separate in peace. And so that's what they do. They separate in peace, and Jacob and his family start heading back to Canaan, going to figure out what to do about his brother Esau. And that's where we end the story today. 20 years. What do we have to learn from this story? Well, this 20 years of Jacob's life was unplanned. He probably didn't think he would be going to live in Haran. Now, yes, it was partially his fault because he upset his brother enough to kill him that he had to flee. But still, this entire period was unplanned. He probably did not envision that he was going to be staying there for 20 years, or that life would unfold as it did. Life threw him a curveball. In fact, it was a 20-year curveball. And so it changed him in many ways. It made him more humble. It made him more patient. And if you've lived long enough, if you've lived any length of time at all, then you will also be thrown a curveball in life. Something that happens that is unplanned. And sometimes those unplanned things can stretch into years or even decades where things didn't go quite as you saw it. And so we call those things wilderness journeys. We get that from the story of Jesus in the wilderness when he was tempted by Satan. We get that from stories like this as well. We get it from stories of the Exodus of the Israelites going to the promised land from Egypt. Well, Jacob was in a wilderness journey, a 20-year one. And one thing we learn is that good things can happen in the wilderness. They don't just happen in the promised land. Good things happen in the wilderness too. Jacob was blessed. He ended up with a very large family that he would not want to give up. He ended up being blessed with many animals, flocks, and so good things happened to him. And that's a good thing for us to remember. You know, you might be in a wilderness journey, or you might feel like you are. That refers to that time in your life where you're in between. You're not where you were when you were really comfortable and sure of everything, but you're also not in a new normal. You don't feel settled. You feel uneasy. You feel uncertain. you really don't feel that secure. And so that in-between time, that's the wilderness journey. And we can have good things happen in the in-between times. It's hard to see it, but we can be blessed. For Jacob, he learned humility, he got married, he had a family, he became more mature. Because when he left, he was immature, and when he comes back, he's ready to return. He's grown up. In fact, you could say his wilderness journey defined him to an extent, because he would be forever changed. In fact, the family that he raised while in the wilderness would become the 12 tribes of Israel, from which Jesus would come, from which the world would be changed forever. And so God works in the wilderness. Blessings can happen. Good things can happen. So we want to remember that. We also want to remember that in the wilderness journey, as we think about these unplanned in-between times in our life, it can be tempting to just pause. Say, okay, I don't know where I am right now, but I'm just going to wait. It can be tempting to think that. I'm just going to wait. I'm going to press pause on life, and I'm just going to wait until I see the promised land again. And when I see the promised land again, then I'll hit play. But life doesn't work that way. Life continues on wherever you are. And so I would like to encourage you, we're all at different places in life. Maybe for you right now, you're in the promised land. Things are going pretty well. You're pretty sure of things. You feel pretty certain, and you're in a comfortable place in life. If so, wonderful. Enjoy that time. You might someday, if you haven't already, which maybe you have already, but you might be called to leave the promised land, or you might be forced to leave the promised land and go into the wilderness for a time. But enjoy that time in the promised land. If you are not there and you feel like you're in the wilderness right now, then continue living. Don't wait until you can see the promised land again, because if you wait, you might wait too long. For Jacob, it was 20 years. Can you imagine if Jacob had just waited for 20 years? If he had not done anything, would he have grown any? Would he have had the family that he had? Probably not. And for us, the temptation can be to pause, but I would like to encourage you to continue living, because God isn't just over there in the promised land and you're out here in the wilderness. God is there, and God is right here with you. And so we got to remember that. God was with Jacob in Haran, and God is with you in your wilderness period. And so continue living, knowing that God can still do good things in the wilderness. You can still be blessed in the wilderness. And you might not know how long you're going to be there. You might not know how long, if it's going to be a year, if it's going to be a month, if it's going to be a decade. But know that God is with you right there, so you don't have to wait. You don't have to wait until you're in that wonderful place, that sure place. God can use you, and God can work through you, and God can bless you right where you are. And so, just as Jacob trusted God in the midst of the wilderness, and God was with him, so I'd like to encourage you, whether you're in the promised land or the wilderness, wherever you are, trust in God. That's so easy to say. So hard to do, though. But what that means is that it doesn't mean you're not afraid. It doesn't mean you don't doubt. It doesn't, but that sounds weird, doesn't it? Trust and doubt, we don't usually think go together. But it doesn't mean you're not afraid. It doesn't mean you don't doubt. It doesn't mean that you have no questions. It doesn't mean that you have to be certain. What it means is that you continue on. That's it. You continue on. And you trust in God, meaning you know that God is with you. Even if it feels that God isn't with you, you know that God is with you. And you believe in the promised land in the future, whenever that's going to be. And you might not know when that's going to be, but you live with God now, and believe in His promise for you, and believe